Judge Sack, you were going to say something about Bob Owen.
No, it starts with Bob Owen, but the story, which means a lot to me, is I have thought, of course, of Bob's coming into the office, my office, shutting the door and saying, "Would you like to?" And I counsel every person, every young person I know and get a chance to talk to, tell them the story and tell them how important it was. Lucky that he came in and a whole bunch of things had to happen for him to walk in that day. But I could have said, no, I'm a young partner here, I've got to work representing the Wall Street Journal, I'll lose my connections. The result, historically, but the other result for me personally is I never would have been a judge had I said no, because it was Bernie Nussbaum who had then been counsel to the president, and to some extent it didn't hurt that Hillary had been there, and I had stayed over at Bill Clinton's house and indeed his state house one night each, so I was close friends. But all of that opened up to me because I just said, I'll ask my wife, or in other words, yes. And from that, all these other things flow.
So you mean if you had said, "I'm not going to ask my wife," that would have been no?
I prefer not to think about that as an eventuality, but or whatever a past eventuality is. No, but no. If she
are you saying she encouraged you to take?
No. That's not what I'm saying. She did encourage me. I'm absolutely not saying that I went to her and asked her. It was clear I wanted to do it, but I don't know what I would have said if she says not on your life. I guess I would have said no. And I know people whose families have said that to them, and I know what they, in some cases, suspect, in other cases, know what they missed because of that. So I'm just saying, that's what I tell them. I say, this is my kind of message to young people. You got to have a break. B, if you show up enough, Woody Allen's, showing up is 80%, which is of success. But you have to say yes. B, you need family support to do it. You can't, some kind of, usually family support to do it. And C, you never know until it happens what's going to come out of it and where it's going to lead. But that's just my lesson to young people.
Let's talk about the not knowing how the movie will end.
Yeah.
When you're in the middle of it, because that brings up the point you were making off camera, which we're going to talk about on camera. It's about your occasional concern about your insignificance.
Yeah. As a judge, I think I have 3 suits to my name. So
it doesn't matter what
you have a robe.
Yeah, it doesn't really matter. You can be like those correspondents who just wear shorts when they're on TV.
I went back to.
Okay, we're going to go. Tell me when we're ready.
Speed.
Okay. You and I were talking off camera
about insignificance. Yeah. I think we've got that. I was going to say that I sometimes talk about people's well-deserved lack of self-esteem. So I don't want this to be too much about how one feels about oneself. That's for a psychiatrist to worry about. But you do. I'm 34 years old. I just become a partner, which is very nice. I didn't have a great deal of experience in this. So I was taking my family down there. There were risks, and I knew that. I mean, the end of Peter and the Wolf, I think it's the grandfather says to the grandson, "But what would you have done if the hunter hadn't come out of the woods and shot the wolf?" What if it had all gone badly in some way or another? I didn't know John Doerr. I mean, there are all kinds of bad things that you don't know what's going to happen. And there's necessarily risk. It could have been entirely inconclusive. We could have taken the blame publicly. So you know there's a risk there. You don't even know. Very early on, I went with Bob Owen, and I don't remember what the subject was, but maybe it was Terry Lensner. We went across town one evening to talk to him, I guess, about how the Irving Committee worked. I'm guessing, that's a guess. But I know we went across, John Doerr and I went across town to just have a little chat with somebody else. And I didn't know whether maybe we were being followed. That people would we could be enemies too. There were people at the end, when it was over, who remarked, people in the street I would listen talking to one another, that the tanks never came down Pennsylvania Avenue. Now, we didn't think they would, but there was a lot at stake in it. What would have happened if the president had said no? At the very end, supposing the president had said no more, we'd been impeached, all kinds of things that we didn't know. And everything that you don't know has some element of risk involved. I mean, it involves, so there was risk of that sort. But the other thing is, there you are, and as I described, my role in this was, I think I was very useful. I'm glad I was there. A bunch of things I worked on did become part of the historic record and were reasonably important. But I know perfectly well that there were a lot of people who could have done that job, and I knew it when I was there. And I knew it was possible that one of us, we were doing, as I've said many times, starting out with 35 things, that we'd blow one of them. And if we could, and maybe we did, but and I did have a sense that of many things I've done in my life, when you're practicing law, you have a pretty good feeling of control over what's going on. When you're a judge, you have a pretty good feeling of control over what's going on. I had no control. What I was doing was literally, and I knew it, literally much more important than I was. And I believe that to this day, that it was much more important than me. And that's scary when you really believe that. That's scary. And as I mentioned to you, I now remember that at that time, the image I had in my head was those old World War II movies showing, or newsreel footage, showing a flight taking off, if that's what they call them, from a sorties, whatever, the flight taking off on the top of an aircraft carrier. And my recollection is that if one of those planes stalled, that is the engine, they couldn't get the engine to turn over, couldn't get it going, they would have to take it, and literally the two guys would take it and push the airplane off the edge of the carrier so that the flight could continue. And I kind of felt about that important as somebody who really didn't, I didn't really matter. And when you're confronted with that in a risky situation, I suppose, if somebody told me, I don't know, there are a lot of jobs like that policemen maybe have the same feeling that if something happens, I go and nobody will care. Soldiers, I don't know if it's the same or not. All I know is that in my experience, it made for troubled sleep. And again, it's also why we were so good to each other, this staff of people. I'll tell you, please let me tell you a story. That goes to this precise point. I'll never forget it. Joe Woods was the chief, old friend, I don't even know from where, but an old friend of John Doerr, and he was the chief lawman. And John Leibovitz was, of course, Bill Weld, I think, was also on that, the pure law staff. And Joe Woods, sometime relatively early on, Joe had me in his office, and Hillary was there, and Fred Altshuler was there. And he dressed me down for some idea I had or some piece of paper I had, and he really, he was very openly critical of something I had said or something I had done. So I went, it was probably 9 o'clock, 8 o'clock by then. I went over, packed my bag, if I did that. And as you may know, you get parking places assigned to you based on seniority. As a result, I had no seniority at all. I had a parking place, but you had to practically go halfway to the Potomac to get to it. So I was walking along the street there, whatever the name of it is, along the back of the office buildings. I got about 2 blocks down towards my car, and I was indeed feeling awful. And I had this pitter-patter of feet. And it's Fred and Hillary running down after me and saying, Bob, 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 it's okay. Don't let this get you down. It's a bit difficult. Whatever they said, it was a don't be upset. It was really good and to comfort me, just to say, don't worry about it. That was so sweet. It says so much to me about Hillary. Fred, you can expect about Hillary, or the way Hillary was 35 years ago. And it says so much about the staff, but also about how difficult it was for chiefs, as I was supposed to be, and Indians alike, to be under those circumstances, and how much we therefore meant to each other, or at least they meant to me. I think we meant to each other.
What was Hillary's job at that point?
I don't know. That's the funny thing. I don't remember exactly what her job was through all of this. I just don't remember.
But she was there.
No, she was very much there. Hillary was not a lady in waiting even at that time. She was a smart young woman from Yale, classmate of Michael Conway's. You should know if you don't. But as down to earth and supportive, in my, having described how things were, she, as were other people, just as down to earth and supportive as you can imagine. And so when I go back, as you like a hypnotist, take me out of myself and back to 74, I'm drawn back to the melancholy is the word I use. When I start to get really into where were we, I have, first of all, my feeling about the facts, the historical facts, and my feeling about these people, and my own personal feelings, they don't entirely overlap. There's an intersection there, but they don't entirely overlap. The thing about the people is things I remember without having to look at a note or think about it. The big thing about what were the agents we were dealing with, it's probably a pretty good idea to have a list of them, because I don't remember that. But that was the human drama, and why I say it's not easy to go back there, even though I've been able to save the sweet things with these people. That is to say, they're still my friends. And we get together, and when we do, we almost always, there are 2 kinds of old friends: those who you get there and you talk to them. I start talking to them wherever they are, and it's as though no time at all has passed. And there's the other kind where you sit down and you haven't seen them in a long time, and you just don't know how to get through the first 3 minutes. We're friends, and that's just very much a part of my experience. And I also, in a way, this is related. I was the odd jobs person, and that's how I got to do tape gaps and gazebos and trains having left the station. And sometimes I would be returned to do odd jobs. One of them, one of our staff members got into trouble on the street with a verbal fight with a woman, and they wound up turning it over to the District of Columbia police and the prosecutor, and I had to. He hadn't done anything wrong, and I managed. My greatest cross-examination was in the chambers of the office of the district attorney, or whatever he's called there. So they called on me to do it. John called me, please take care of this, and so I took care of it. I don't want to say I was a bagman, mind you, but odd jobs. But my best recollection, and the one that I think is worth recollecting, was we came out with our own, and you mentioned this earlier about the tapes. We came with our own version of the tapes. And they became public, I guess, after we released them to the House Committee. And one of the things was they were much, much better transcripts than the White House provided us. Some of the reasons being technical. We got a very good sound guy who made them work properly, and made them sound better. I mean, you put the head of the tape at a different angle or something like that, and you could hear things that were startling compared to the tapes that we had, the unprocessed tapes that we had heard. And one of our transcripts, and I could figure out what it was, but one of our transcripts came out, and it was this is hypothetically stated, but it's the same point. And the president said something like, somebody said, what will we do about, how will we keep this from coming out? And the president, and maybe the president who asked, somebody else who says it, but he says, Nash, and he's cut off. He's saying, national security was what he was saying. Well, our staff had put together this tape, this transcript. And on the transcript, it said Earl Nash instead of Nash. And so Maureen Barden, who I remember very well, she came kind of hustling up to me, Bob, we have this problem with the transcript. Bernie says, Bernie, I shouldn't say this for him, but he's later told me, boy, he says, I really understood the impulse to cover it up, he says, but it didn't. And she goes, who is Earl Nash? We don't know who he is. Everybody, all the papers are calling him. Who is Earl Nash? So she says, you call him. Why me? It wasn't agency abuse. So I said, okay, I'll call him. So we found either an E. Nash or an Earl Nash, indeed, out in suburban Maryland, I think, maybe Virginia. So I pick up the phone, and I call, and a woman answers. And I said, Earl Nash? I said, I'm calling from the Congress, from, however we introduced ourselves. I'm assistant to, however, I made it clear I had some official interest. And she just starts to bawl. I said, I don't know what he's done. I don't know where he is, but people have been calling me all afternoon wanting to know who Earl Nash is. So I guess somebody finally had to get up the gumption and point out that had been a transcription error.
So you told her that it was a mistake, and what did you issue a
GIS? Oh, I know that we cleared it up right away. I'm sure we did. And the thing that proves it's fine is nobody remembers this story but me, and
then the family of Earl Nash.
And yes, may that they survive. Yeah, and occasionally I will needle by my former colleagues by arriving at a dinner or something, asking whether Earl. I know what I did. I once put a placemat there for Earl Nash. One of these things.
So I'll have to ask Maureen about, because was she overseeing the transcribers?
I can't, she was very much involved in the process. Maureen was very much involved in everything. She was the, I mean, it was all about, as we've talked, it was all about documents and tapes and transcripts, which are documents. And she was just in charge, and she was there. She, you know, she was famous. I can't swear I saw it myself, but she was famous for being there, you know, after everyone had left at 2 or 3 in the morning with a vacuum cleaner cleaning out her library space. Mike Conway, who you will interview, I particularly remember fairly late into this process of putting, I can't swear what it was we were putting together, whether it was a final report, more likely the statements of information, but he looked kind of beaten up. And he says, I've been up all night 4 times in my life, when my son was born, when my daughter was born, and twice last week.
How did you feel when the committee members reacted not completely positively to the statements of information? That there was they felt they needed a little bit more help to get through them, and that's when the seminars began, I believe.
I'm hesitating because I'm not sure how much I'm thinking about what I would have thought then now, or I'm thinking what I thought then. I don't remember being upset about it at all, because, now this is the part I don't know, it's retrospect, I think that's kind of what they were supposed to be. They were supposed to say, here are the facts, okay, and we weren't supposed to put it together. We did not put those facts together. Now, I think that that was John's thought, that let them put it together. I'm sure that's his thought. In fact, I seem to remember his saying something like that to me about the statements of information. Don't put it together. Let them do it. Let them ask questions. But if you do, you're at that stage of the proceedings, you're being too argumentative. You're taking one side. You're looking for an impeachment.
So again, to help the viewer and researcher, your job was not to make a case, or was it to make a case?
It was to put all of the evidence out there upon which a case could be made. That's exactly what it was. We knew what the case would be. We knew that someday, we knew, I'm sure we knew, I'm sure John Doerr knew, that some, recollections pop up. But that someday he would make the case, which he did. But the first stage was to get this out because we didn't want people, the point was to be as neutral as we possibly could, put it all in, and then, as I've seen very fine lawyers do elsewhere, string up the beads. But you had to get the beads out first, and then you string the beads.
And how was he going to, and he would string up the beads in presenting it to the committee?
That's my understanding. How he obviously did, in fact, at the beginning of the actual proceedings, the public proceedings, he did make an opening sentence, opening statement, and he did string up the beads at that point. But he was getting the evidence that he was getting the evidence to them first before telling them what he thought the evidence means. He said somewhere in this process, and I hope he won't, I thought it was so meaningful, such a great insight. He said that Congressman Hogan of, also I think from Maryland, Republican, after this was well into the process, this was in March, it couldn't have been, it was later, when we had become, or were becoming, argumentative. And there's a lot about Renata Adler, and if you've read any of her stuff, and I don't know anything about what was going on in John's head. I don't know if he started out saying, I'm going to get the son of a bitch. He surely never let us know if that's what he did. And, but he said that Hogan, Congressman Hogan, is a Republican, and he's going to vote for this, he says. He said that's because he's an FBI man, former FBI man, and he responds to facts. He cares about facts, and that's the way he worked. A couple of while talking about John Doerr, something of interest, which you'll get elsewhere, but while we're running, the most extraordinary thing that John did was to make his case beginning on June 23rd, before we had the tape. He made his case beginning in June 23rd, 1972. That bag, you will have people who know better than me, that bag that was brought over from the special prosecutor started in February or March of the following year. And John said, and this I remember personally, John said, President Nixon is a man who is intimately involved in absolutely every detail of everything. And the notion that he didn't know early on that that what had happened at the Watergate and what the problems were, he says it's impossible. And I'm oversimplifying because my memory isn't that good, but the kind of the breaking point for the division amongst Congress was the committee was on, really starts in September 15th with the conversation with John Dean, which is earlier, I think, but that's kind of when, and did he know anything before then? And some people said, no, he couldn't have. He didn't know what was going on at the Watergate. It was just afterwards that people were coming to him telling what was happening. Well, John said that can't be true. And there were people on the committee who agreed with him, a majority, and there were people who didn't, and that was the dividing line. Then comes along United States versus Nixon and the Pentagon Papers. No, that was the year before. The Nixon tapes, that's 3 years before. The Nixon tapes. And they ruled the way they ruled, saying that they had to be disclosed. And one of the tapes was the June 23rd tape, I guess it's June 23rd, and it has to be released, and it's released. And that absolutely breaks the branch off underneath the people who said he should, and they all changed sides. Because they were on that limb, and that limb was cut off. But it became a smoking gun, I think, because of John's insistence, his willingness to say that it began then and it didn't begin in September and it didn't begin in March. And between the time the tape became available, was it 2 weeks before the president left office?
It was actually less than 2 weeks.
Yeah, well, go ahead.
I just wanted to ask you about that. You have that case that's making its way from the Court of Appeals. Was there ever any question, did you hear, was there ever any discussion about waiting until that case was adjudicated? Because you would have received so many more tapes.
I don't remember any consideration of that. I don't know. I actually went over with some of my colleagues and listened to the decision actually being read out loud by the Chief Justice Berger, who, as people often say, used to say, that he was the captain's captain. That is, there's one captain who steered the ship and one came down and made an appearance in the dining room of the cruise ship, and he was the one who makes the appearance, meaning he looked like it, and he walked like it, he talked like a Chief Justice of the United States, and he made that. But I don't think there are any number of things that the court could have done other than that. Any number of, they could have asked for re-argument, they could have sent it back down. They could have split 4-4. Only 8 of them voted. It was in the middle of the summer. They certainly could have put it off till the end of the summer, which by now you know the kind of pressure we've been talking about. But I certainly don't remember anybody. I guess nobody had any idea that the ruling was going to come down so quickly after we had done the bulk of the staff had done the bulk of its work.
Now, with your discussions with John Doerr, Joe Woods, Bernie Nussbaum, since you didn't know,
Joe Woods, by the way, was gone by then. In June, Joe Woods went back to his firm and did not stay on after some. I think it was in June. I have reason to think it's in June.
I'm hoping to interview him, but what do you remember of why he left?
He said, and I had no reason to doubt it. John Doerr told us that he had his firm that he had started, and he had promised to come in for a month or 2 months, and he felt he was neglecting his responsibility to his firm.
Can you remember discussions about how you would prepare this case for the Senate? I mean, obviously you were doing it for the House and you're doing it for the committee, but were you thinking ahead to a Senate trial?
Only in the vaguest term. Maybe John was. Again, I remember talking to Bernie, saying, God, Mike, this has been awful tough on us, awful tough on our families. If we were asked to stay for the trial, would we do it? The answer, I'm sure I remember, it was, well, they asked, of course we'd do it. But if Bernie had left his practice, I had left his practice. But we never, beyond our own personal reflections of it, we never did. You just said something, we were talking about Joe Woods
Let me
leaving.
hold that